To those of you on the east coast of Australia, good morning. To those of us in other time zones, good afternoon, depending on where you'll find yourself today. Thanks, Jax, for the welcome and for the acknowledgement to country. I too would like to take a moment to invite us all to connect with where we're gathering today. Social Design Sydney is typically hosted on Gadigal country, which are also the lands and waters where I was born. And I do my best to honour in how I connect with and conserve place. So it's with an open heart, one that's actually beating quite strongly right now, that I share my gratitude and my respect to the elders past, present and future who care for Gadigal country and all country in Australia, and who continue to sing these lands and waters, never ceded, always sacred, into creation. Today, I find myself in northern Italy, of all places. Up the road from my home, there are ruins from the Gola Secca people from 15,000 years ago through to the Romans from 2,000 years ago. And across the world, history's traces take many different forms. So let us take a moment to connect with the place where we each find ourselves. How has it been cared for? How has its history been traced, and its myths and dreamingscapes? And as we reflect and connect with the lands and waters where we are, we can perhaps begin to sense them, to shift out of linear thinking and into the experiential, the relational that connects us all. Because we're all connected in the decolonial world and everyone has a place. But before we enter, it's always important to acknowledge our situation, our position, where we are coming from, as this is a key aspect of decoloniality. So who am I to introduce you to the decolonial world? Well, this introduction unfolds through my interpretation of it, an understanding that's grown over 15 years of working with emerging and marginalised communities through mainly participatory and innovative techniques to shift power. Like this photo of an event I did with the Design Studio for Social Intervention in Boston. I haven't read much on decolonisation actually, but I've been lucky enough to have been exposed to its processes, its practices, its praxis in deeply powerful ways. And this has given me a very keen sense of the decolonial. In any case, decolonisation must be driven by those who have been colonised and who are most impacted by colonial power structures, or its matrix of power as it's known. Some have been more colonised than others, and this manifests in degrees of oppression, access, exclusion, discrimination. At the same time, as I'll go on to talk about, we have all been colonised, whether it's in our culture, our ways of thinking, the land we live on, the way the system includes or excludes us in certain ways, and even the technologies we use. If we're to begin living the difference that is decoloniality, then we are called to live the collective and otherwise world, while understanding that we're all coming from our situation, our position. This is not the same as labeling ourselves with an identity. So let me give you an example. Because of my own background, I feel that my own true place of belonging is in the connections between people, not a nation. The situation I come from involves that I benefit from settler colonialism and white privilege, even if my family were refugees and we're a minority. The situation I come from involves that I also experience degrees of marginalisation due to my ethnicity, my religion, my gender, and now also my differently abled daughter. Before we go on, one final important acknowledgement. Decolonisation is becoming a trend across the global north. It is vital that if and when we engage in decolonial projects, we involve and are guided by those who are most impacted by the colonial matrix of power. I'll just ask people to mute themselves, please. Thank you. So it's vital that we're guided by those who are most impacted by the colonial matrix of power. And in Australia, for instance, those are our First Nations. And I'm so honoured to be here alongside you, Tristan, for this reason. Okay. So there's no one definition of decoloniality. It's connected starting points, it's shared directions and ways of being. To understand it, let's enter the decolonial world. Let's orient to its history, its present, and its prospective futures. The decolonial world is muddy, it's blurry, it's a complex terrain, and some could say it's easy to get things wrong. I'm going to point to some key areas through my own interpretation of them, and I'm going to encourage you to take further steps to acquaint with them in a way that works for you. The ground of the decolonial world is what is often referred to as the colonial modern. This is the colonial matrix of power that tied the entire globe to European modernity from the 16th to 19th centuries and continues in the background today. It does this through an often assumed, invisible Eurocentrism, but also imperialism in the way our dominant society thinks, acts, and functions. This can range from structural injustice and ongoing indigenous dispossession to racial capitalism and gender violence. Decolonisation is the literal political delinking of the colonial powers from their colonies across the global south, beginning in the 20th century. Decolonisation tends to function systemically, mainly in the political and the economic realm. And a key issue is that decolonisation has never quite completed. For example, even after receiving so-called independence, there are still some countries in Africa whose telecom networks are owned by France, who in turn profits from their use. Post-colonialism is the field of study that critiques the impact of colonialism and Western imperialism, focusing particularly on history, culture, and discourse. Some notable post-colonial thinkers include Frantz Fanon for Wretched of the Earth, Edward Said for Orientalism, and Gayatri Spivak for Can the Subaltern Speak? It's been called a transformational politics aimed at reducing inequalities and hierarchies in the academy. And there is a question around the appropriateness of the term post in post-colonial, considering colonisation is still occurring in many forms. Speaking of, neo-colonisation is basically the way in which people and parts of the world are being colonised in new and powerful ways, mainly through capitalism, neoliberalism, Western imperialism, and globalisation. Examples include infrastructure development projects where the countries and corporations that invest in the development then own, manage, and profit from the infrastructure while exploiting the local land and labour. Or digital colonialism, such as where Facebook, an American corporation, has the power to impact the election results in Kenya. In the end, the colonial modern can also be understood through an intersectional lens. At its most simple, intersectionality is a framework for understanding the cumulative impact of intersecting degrees of oppression and exclusion. These are generally across gender, class, race, religion, orientation, and disability. For example, a single Black mother experiences intersecting degrees of discrimination. Discrimination in the colonial modern intersects with patriarchy, racial capitalism, and ableism. Whereas in the otherwise of decoloniality, these intersectional factors are simply degrees of difference through which we're always already connected. There is no one definition of decoloniality, but a number of guiding elements that can be enacted. It's driven by the need to shift away from Eurocentric logic, metaphysics, and ontology, which are so deeply embedded in our epistemologies and our subjectivities. South African scholar and practitioner Sabelo Nodlovu-Gatsheni calls for epistemic freedom out of this epistemic systemic crisis. I'd say that a goal of decoloniality is the collective resurgence and reclaiming of agency through the colonial modern's matrix of power over our subjectivities, our gender and sexuality, our land and labour, and authority. This removal, refusal, and call for justice is enacted through transdisciplinary processes, practice, and praxis that can create space for an otherwise world. So let's take a look at some examples of what decolonial projects can look like. One of the most important ways in which we can decolonize is by ensuring justice in history telling and heritage conservation. Decolonizing the museum is one way in which this is beginning to happen around the world. A key approach is to return objects that were stolen by colonizers. For example, on the right is a photo of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Guyagal shield, seized from the warrior Cumin at Botany Bay in 1770. And it is a part of the world's largest collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artefacts at the British Museum. A group of Guyagal activists have been advocating for the shield to be returned, however, this has not yet happened. Another key example of decolonial history telling is the way in which communities are advocating for commemorative statues of colonizers, colonialists, slave traders to be removed. On the left is an image of the removal of a statue of Cecil Rhodes from the University of Cape Town, which was a part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. This has been a really key protest movement that began in 2015 in South Africa that advocated for the removal of the statue and the decolonisation of educational curriculum across South Africa, which set the precedents for many others to follow around the world. Okay. Continuing the importance of conservation and resurging cultural heritage, the Bush Farm social enterprise was born out of the need to provide wild harvested medicinal plants for community members around Central Australia forced to leave country for dialysis. Using traditional healthcare knowledges to treat physical ailments, it also builds capacities and provides employment. Beyond heritage, there are also increasing projects that are exploring how to decolonize wealth and philanthropy. For example, the Global Fund for Community Foundations Shift the Power movement is garnering increasing support for people-led approaches to philanthropic and development funding that make space for restorative justice and decolonial agency building. At the other end of the spectrum, there are increasing decolonial projects responding to technological advancements and our prospective futures. Decolonize the Internet is a campaign led by Who's Knowledge, a collective that are trying to centre the knowledge of communities from the global south that actually make up 3/4 of the world's population and are unfairly represented on the internet. It develops resources and toolkits to support building better representation and preservation of a fair internet. Decolonizing AI is emerging in various parts of the world, including at the new 3AI Institute in Canberra, to respond to two key realities. Firstly, that the algorithms of machinic intelligence are typically designed by a small, Eurocentric male minority of the world's population, and this is already creating discrimination, including, for example, in facial recognition technology. And secondly, that the history of AI actually includes a number of alternative knowledges that need to be brought back into its development. So now that we have a broad understanding of the decolonial world, let's consider how we all can step into it. Okay, so decoloniality cannot exist without the quotidian, the daily transdisciplinary practice of it. This is based in a praxis that has a number of guiding elements, some of which I'll share here. Ultimately, in the wise words of decolonial sociologist Gurminder Bumrah, it's about an engagement with difference that makes a difference to what was originally thought. Situated refers to the reality that we are all coming from our own unique situation, like what I did at the beginning of the presentation. And this inevitably impacts the way we can step into decoloniality. This is very different from identity politics and is not about creating division through our difference, but rather by understanding that our difference, in fact, creates value for our becoming collective. At the same time, in order to shift out of the impact of the colonial modern on the way we think, perceive, and act, we need to unlearn frames of thinking and modes of being that, in fact, are not ours. This is vital on the path to relearning the always already way of being with nature and with each other that is decoloniality. Decolonial practices acknowledge that certain knowledges are often overlooked, those on the margins, those outside of the academy. Rather than place some knowledges over others, in decoloniality, collective knowledges are valued and essential for moving into a decolonial otherwise in a communal and an emergent balance. Conviviality, originally originating with Ivan Illich from the 1970s, has emerged as a key approach in decoloniality and post-development for how to live together with, in the words of my colleagues at the Convivial Thinking Collective, equity, mutual respect for each other in that natural world, and assuming joint responsibility for the ways we live, the ways we act, the ways we engage. The in-between is the muddy middle. It's the border space that acknowledges those on the margins while also opening itself up to be permeable. Decoloniality lives on the border between the personal and the collective. And it's this in-between that is the most powerful decolonial space, because it's here that the otherwise becomes possible. It's here where we live the pluriverse. Decoloniality is made up of many worlds, the pluriverse. As per the post-development dictionary, a pluriversal space hopes to overcome patriarchal attitudes, racism, casteism, and other forms of discrimination, to bring forth an otherwise that is always already here. And as the Zapatistas of Mexico, one of the oldest decolonial projects, have said, many worlds make us, many worlds fit. So, speaking of our many worlds and how we can pluriversally inhabit the decolonial one, let's take one final step together and consider how we can move from our different situations or positions into the collective custodianship and collective impact that is decoloniality. This activity is designed to give you a sense of your situation, your position, where you're coming from in relation to key decolonial concepts as we step into the world together. I'm going to say 5 words. And as I say each word, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on how you relate to this word, how you resonate with it, how you might be impacted by it, and then visualize yourself taking a step. Oh. Power. Access. Difference. Collectivity. An otherwise world. So, hopefully this has helped you get an understanding of how decoloniality is a way of being, one that we each step into in our own way, with a consciousness of the worlds we are walking through, the power structures we are implicated in, and the collectivities we can connect with. Decoloniality to me feels first. It's something that we always already know. It's a state of being with another and all others in resonance, without seeing them as other, but simply as another part of ourself. It is what lives between us. It doesn't matter if this doesn't feel right to you right now, right away. What's important is that everyone accesses decoloniality how they do. We each find our own way to it. And this is why I've chosen to introduce decoloniality instead of decolonization to you, because it's a way of being in the decolonial world first. And in order to design in a decolonial way, it's necessary to embody the approach rather than act outside of it. I hope that this introduction has given you a grasp on how together we can do difference differently. Thank you.